to the Ideas Without Frontiers podcast series, Visionary Voices. This podcast is brought to you by the Cascade Foundation. We are committed to helping educational institutions become more globally connected, to help them overcome the barriers they face and deliver real transformative change. If you want to know more about our foundation and learn about our community of action, you can visit our website at cascade-foundation.eu. And don't forget to subscribe.
Hello and welcome to the latest Ideas Without Frontiers podcast from Cascade Foundation. And my name's Mark Majewski-Anderson, and I will be interviewing today Hans de Wit. And I'd just like to welcome you to our podcast today. Hans, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be there.
So Hans, I think we just start off, if you could tell us a little bit about your trajectory. I know you've been working in internationalization for many years. So how did you get to this point? And really what drives and motivates you in terms of your interest in internationalization?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's indeed a long time that I've been involved in this field of internationalization of higher education. Originally, I'm a social anthropologist and was working on Latin America studies, and had my study abroad in 1976 in Lima, Peru, as part of my field work for my master thesis. So even already as a student, I was part of internationalization of higher education. But after a very short academic career in University of Utrecht and the Center for Latin America Studies in Amsterdam, it was very clear that there was no kind of really possibility to continue my academic career in Latin America Studies. At that time, Latin America was not really an academic priority. So I applied for a job as Director of International Affairs at Tilburg University, and they were very active in Latin America in capacity building projects. So they had projects in Peru, in Nicaragua, in Costa Rica, in El Salvador, etc. And so I was still young, and I applied, and did not think that I would have a serious chance at that time. And three people who were in front of me in the selection just dropped out, so they had basically to take me. And that was a quite interesting experience, because I could continue my work in Latin America, but at the same time I was wondering, well, I'm responsible for international relations of the university, but there's more than Latin America. Why don't we do anything in Europe? Why don't we do anything in Asia and in North America? So I started to look a little bit broader than that, and established partnerships with universities in the United States. I became a member, made the university a member of ISEP, International Student Exchange Program in the United States. Started working with Japanese universities and in Europe. And so around 1986, there was the time that also the European Commission started to think about European programs, establishing the Erasmus program, etc. So basically, my ideas aligned with what was happening at the European level. And the University of Amsterdam, which was my alma mater, asked me to become Director of International Affairs of the University of Amsterdam in 1986, and I have been working there till 2003 or something like that. First as Director of International Affairs, and then as Vice President for International Affairs. And I basically did the same there. They had basically capacity building projects before, and had nothing in Europe, nothing in North America. So I was basically asked by the president around that time to develop this kind of programs, and also to start up the Erasmus scheme programs. And then I thought, well, I could reinvent the wheel myself, but there must be others in Europe who have been doing this. So why don't I try to connect with them? And I was supported in that with my staff member Hans van Dijk, who came from Nuffic. So we together started to explore the possibility, can we not create some kind of network of people involved in international relations in Europe? And so we got in contact with Axel Markert from the University of Tübingen, and people in Denmark, Niels Gottlieb, and in France, Frans Kamer, and others. And basically that was the start of the European Association for International Education, which was then founded in 1989 in Amsterdam, and still has its headquarters in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And became the annual conference for international education, basically copying on what NAFSA already was doing in the United States, but giving it a European dimension. So that was my first basically active engagement in the international arena on international education in a period that there was still most of the European universities trying to see, oh, we have to do this. We have to respond to this new initiatives basically coming from the European Commission. How should we do that? And then I thought, well, I'm doing this, but I have no idea what we are talking about. What is international education, as we called it at that time? How are we doing that in Europe, and is that different in the United States or in Asia or in Latin America, etc.? So I became curious to look into what do we mean when we talk about this, and I was then asked by the IMHC program of the OECD to organize some seminars on that topic, and based on those seminars to write a book. And then I came in contact with Jay Knight at that time working at Ryerson in Toronto, who was also wrote at that time her PhD thesis, or finished her PhD thesis on internationalization of higher education in Canada. And we exchanged ideas, and we started to work together, and basically then in the 1990s have been starting to working with others to develop a much more conceptual view of what is internationalization of higher education. Why are we doing this? What is it? How are you going to do it? What are the challenges and opportunities, and what are the differences and similarities? And we published with co-authors from the different regions books about the topic. And then I also thought, well, there's not much written about it also academically in journals. So I created the Journal of Studies in International Education as the first really publication, academic peer-reviewed journal on internationalization of higher education, with support from organizations like the European Association for International Education, NAFSA, AIEA, etc., to make it possible for people to write about their research on internationalization of higher education. And I also finished my PhD on the topic in Amsterdam in 2001. So I gradually came from a practitioner scholar, and now in my later phase of my career, I'm more focused on the scholarly side exclusively, not being more in administration, etc. And also moved first to a professorship in the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences and Internationalization, co-founded the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at the Catholic University in Milan, and then became director of Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, with which I was already affiliated as a previous Fulbright scholar and visiting lecturer in the period before. So basically, it was from a practitioner side, looking into what is conceptually meaning internationalization and trying to understand that, and still trying to understand it, because it looks very simple, but it is a very diverse, broad, and always changing concept of what we mean. So that is keeping me alive in doing my scholarly work and keeping me active. engaged and trying still to understand and to read and to learn from young scholars around the world, particularly also from the global south. So what does internationalization mean in their context? Because there's not one model that fits all. Internationalization is very much context related and changes constantly in reaction to the changing context at the institutional level, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. So it is a fascinating concept, and that keeps you busy until today.
I mean, it's an inspiring kind of journey, because really you've been at the forefront of the development of internationalization policy, really from its beginnings. And I think that EIE and the whole kind of perspective we have on internationalization has very much been defined by those pioneering projects that you took part in, and really resonate still today. But I think that one thing you've touched on there, and I guess that one of the kind of impressive aspects of your work is you're really continuing to look quite critically, and I think a lot of your work kind of highlights the disconnect or the imbalance between the global north and the global south in terms of internationalization policy. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that has manifested itself?
Yeah, I think it's very important, as I said, to consider internationalization as context related. So if people write about internationalization, they make several mistakes. First of all, they think that internationalization is something very clear, but it's quite different if you talk about mobility of students, mobility of programs and faculty, or internationalization of the curriculum, or virtual and choral, etc. These are all kind of different elements which sometimes are connected, but in many cases are used by people as kind of synonym to internationalization as the whole process. And I try to be critical about that approach, because then we make mistakes about what would be the right strategy and focus to focus on. The other one is that indeed they talk about internationalization in general terms without understanding that there's a fundamental difference between, if you talk about internationalization in the context of, let's say, Malaysia or Costa Rica or Kenya, or if you talk about United States or Europe. I always make the comparison that internationalization means something completely different between Boston College, where I was working for the past 10 years, and Harvard or MIT. Even although they are only 5 miles away from each other and in the same city, there are fundamentally different types of institutions. And by that they have a different kind of focus on what internationalization means. With Boston College being a more Jesuit Catholic institution, it means much more related to social justice and the whole person, where in Harvard and MIT it is much more related to their status as being world-class research universities, which think that they are, by being world-class universities, being international by nature, without really doing much about it to make that really happen. So contexts are very different, and we always have been thinking about the global south as being an important part of that. Even in the work that I did in the 1990s with Jay Knight, we worked on internationalization in Asia. We worked on internationalization in Latin America, and we did not do that ourselves, but we always stimulated people from those regions to write about what that internationalization mean for them. And at that time, that was still very limited, but it has brought the whole debate further in those countries about thinking about how does it relate to their identity, to their context. And we did it also in Africa. And by that, I think the current situation of more emphasis on what does it mean for the global south, is already embedded in the work that we did in the 1990s to think about it. And people still then were very much focusing on copying what we were doing. And gradually that devolved into a whole debate about, yeah, but we should not copy, we should perceive internationalization from our own identity, from our own context. And that what you see now by the next generation of young scholars and people like Sean Stein and Santiago Gutierrez and many others who are looking into the whole relationship between internationalization and decolonization and creating own identity, which is, I think, important work. And they go maybe further than I was at that time. But that's also what we can learn from the next generation, and that's what they should do. They should identify their perception of internationalization, not simply thinking about what we have been writing before, and should also be criticizing us. So that's what I do, and I just published an essay in the Journal of Studies in International Education, which came out this week, about indeed critically thinking about what do we mean with internationalization of higher education. So going back to the old definitions by Jay Knight, our definition in 2015 with Fiona Hunter and Eva Egon Polak and Laura Howard, and say, well, is this still the right approach if you look into what has been happening over the past years and what has been written about it? What is the critique by people like Simon Margenson on the definition? And maybe say, well, we should try not to think about it as a one concept and one meaning, but much more look into why are we wanting to do this, and what is our role in this? What is, and in particular in relation to issues like equity, inclusion, and social responsibility, which are key concepts for the future of higher education and society, also should be the driving forces for what we want to do in internationalization. And as a reaction to what has happened over the past 20 years, to see internationalization basically as an competitive and income generation type of neoliberal approach to recruiting international students and competition for rankings, competition for whatever we do, internationalization, making that radical shift and not standing on the sideline, but saying, well, if we really want to make a difference, then we have to shift the whole focus of what has been the dominant discourse and the dominant action into internationalization over the past 20 years.
I think it's really interesting for me because I think something similar happened with innovation. I remember working with Latin American universities, and we were doing innovation projects. And the trouble was, I realized we were basically trying to graft the model, say, from MIT or from Cambridge into a university in Bolivia. And it just didn't fit for their context. And the idea that really the universities themselves already had a lot to offer in terms of the societal benefit that they were offering their communities. And so this kind of whole idea of social innovation at an international level kind of developed from that. And the idea of really we shouldn't be thinking of, things like IP and the models that had been prescribed by successful universities in high income countries. I guess one of the big challenges is that the universities in low and middle income countries are almost forced to align themselves with the models that have been developed in the global north. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how does a university in that situation, how does it resist that, and what kind of processes that can it undergo in order to ensure that its internationalization policy is successful, but also has its own identity?
The relationship between institutions of the global north and the low and mid-income countries has always been a very tenuous relationship, dominated by the the power that the institutions in the global north had, because they had access to funding organizations, they had access to knowledge databases much better, they had access to dissemination possibilities. They were perceived by institutions of the global south as being the ones that they could learn from, instead of thinking about partners in the global north as they need us for their interests. And that has been a process that has for a long time been making those partnerships very unequal and complicated. It created some kind of dependency role, which the institutions in the global south also enjoyed, because they got money. And that was very essential for them, because they didn't have the money. But at the same time, it didn't stimulate them to think about their own identity and their own needs for society. And only more recently, in Asia and in Latin America, you see that now that funding from the global north is disappearing. And so they need to develop their own power relationships. Africa is still much more complicated, because now lots of money goes into Africa. And so you see that that still makes them very dependent. But even there, you see already some kind of interest to say, well, yeah, but what about our own interests? What about our own needs? What about our own competences? And I think that's a fascinating process where institutions in lower mid-income countries can better think about what is needed for them. I was once in the Amazon region, and there you saw institutions that collaborated mainly with the global north, in each of them individually, instead of working together in the Amazon region as universities to think about how can we solve the problems that we have across our borders, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil. How can we work on climate change issues and all kind of other issues that are important for survival of that region. So now they think much better, oh, we should work much more south-south together, and maybe still bring in partners from abroad for knowledge, but not in a dependent relationship anymore. You see it also in the teaching. Again, I was in Colombia at a nursing school, and the dean was worried about why do we have to teach from our government in English at the B1 level for our nursing school kids, but it's nearly impossible to learn them English because they don't have the possibility to practice it. They don't feel the need for it. So what should we do? And I said, well, you should tell the government to stop doing that, because none of your nursing school students likely will ever use English, will not going to travel abroad, but they have to learn about the local context. They have to work about indigenous populations and indigenous patients, etc. So try to change that kind of national thing that the dominance is English, the dominance is the global north. No, you have to develop your own needs, your own objectives, etc. So that, in my view, is very essential if we talk about partnerships and if we talk about the future of internationalization. The initiative, the innovation has to come from there. We will not in the global north be innovative. We will continue to do what we ever have done. We will try to recruit students, although we see increasing competition coming from the global south in that region. We will try to be dominant in our dissemination journals, etc., books. We will try to be dominant in our ranking positions and in everything. But that will last maybe still for quite a while, but it will diminish. And if the global south institutions of higher education develop their own identities, their own resources, their own partnerships among themselves, that will change the world drastically. And not always in a good way, but in most cases in a more positive way than the current situation.
Yeah, it's interesting because in research as well, we have researchers from the UK researching issues where researchers from countries in the global south would be far more well placed to research those issues. And I think that we're continually seeing academics in the global north trying to research something that really they don't have enough experience and don't have enough knowledge on the ground to be able to offer something especially. And I think that this is something I would just wanted to ask you in terms of the global north. This isn't a one-way street, is it? Because really we can benefit from a more equitable approach to internationalization as well.
Yeah, we should if we want to, but that still needs time to develop. And one of my critiques is that we talk a lot about issues like equal partnerships, inclusion, and about internationalization of the curriculum at home and global learning for all, etc. But if you look at the reality, it's nice in words that we say that, but if you look at the actions, the whole discourse goes still everywhere about how can we recruit international students from the global south. That's the whole debate in the UK. That's the whole debate in the Netherlands, although there is this whole nationalist populist reaction to that happening at the same time. But it is done black or white. We are in favor or we are against, but a nuanced approach about what are the ethical dimensions of that whole strategy are completely absent in whole that debate. And that's what I find very frustrating to see that that's still happening.
Yes, and I was going to bring this up that now in the last few years we see the rise in populism, the economic, financial pressures on universities, and in general the poly crisis, the multi crisis around the world. How do you feel? Do you feel quite pessimistic? Do you see any kind of reason for optimism, or is it do you feel kind of despondent at the direction we're taking?
Well, yeah, I mean, these days it's very difficult to be very optimistic because there are so many issues at stake in our societies and at the global level, geopolitical tensions, the wars in Ukraine, the Israeli Hamas conflict and the implications for the Middle East, China, Russia, it's getting very complicated. And academic cooperation and internationalization are based on opening frontiers, and frontiers are closing in the global north for knowledge security, for nationalism and populist approaches, and frontiers are closing also in many countries in the global south who have also kind of nationalist kind of approach to things and not anymore open to an open discourse. So it is very difficult to be optimistic, particularly if you relate that to issues like the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, etc., etc., to see, well, if there is a way out in the future. At the same time, we see at the grassroots level in institutions of higher education, mostly again in the global south, but also in some institutions in the global north, we see positive developments like using the online as a kind of instrument to make it possible to have much more interaction between students and staff from different regions, etc. So the choral kind of dimension. We see much more initiatives for joint and dual degrees in which students and staff work together. We see, even although we still don't know what the impact is, the European University Initiative as a kind of alliances of working much closer together, and how that impacts hopefully also certain initiatives in other regions of the world. ASEAN countries are getting more and more working together. we see some trends in Latin America, although mainly at the institutional level, not at the political level. So there are some positive elements, but overall, I must say, I'm not very optimistic these days about what is happening in the world and how that impacts higher education and its international dimensions.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you say about the grassroots activities, and I think in many ways that's why we founded the Cascade Foundation, because we felt that there were a lot of grassroots activities. There's plenty of opportunities, but it's very difficult to do it through institutions very often that have very specific objectives and KPIs, like student recruitment and things like that. I really appreciate you kind of sharing your thoughts, and they are really inspiring, certainly to me directly. And I feel that we're trying to do in practice what you've come out of practice and then researched and then coming full circle. I'm just wondering for yourself, because you've had this amazing trajectory, where do you feel yourself at a personal level? Are you ready to retire because you deserve it, or are you thinking more in terms of a next chapter?
Well, yeah, academics never retire, and as I said in the beginning, there's so much interesting things that I'm still learning and writing about. So that's important. I always have looked at the next generation. So that is what we have done when we created the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at the Cattolica in Milan. We created this possibility for doctoral students from all over the world to work together on their PhDs and to make it possible to create a kind of doctoral community. We do that in the Center for International Higher Education with a sponsorship of World Education Service with our Summer Institute, where we also bring doctoral students from around the world together. But that's the next generation. I've been able to assist a lot of students in their PhD programs from around the world, because I think that is where the next phase for internationalization has to come from. And so that's also one of the positive elements that we see in this difficult times, that there is a whole generation of young scholars that are interested in stimulating much more inclusive and equal internationalization policy in their research, but also in their practice. And that's what, in my current activities, I try to do as much as possible as well. One of my current projects is, together with Elspeth Jones and Betty Lisk, to write a book, Understanding Internationalization, where we try to create a kind of small textbook, you could say, about all the elements that we have been discussing in the podcast. What do we mean? Why are we doing this? What does internationalization at home of the curriculum mean? What does mobility mean, and what kind of different mobilities there are, and what are some of the challenges in ethics? So that is a project that we are currently working on. And a similar book I'm writing much more with Philip Albach and one of my graduated PhD students, Tessa de Laquille, is Understanding International Higher Education, so the broader higher education in the global context part. Because I think we don't have that kind of textbooks. We have a lot of material, and I will not say it's a textbook that people have to obey to, but much more that is the foundation where you can bring on the next step for the next generation further, so that they can critique on that. I always say that I prefer much more that somebody critiques me that say, well, I am the guru, which I sometimes hear to say. I don't care about it. I mean, I think it's important. Critique brings you further. Debate brings you further. That's very important. That's what I try to do in my current work. I'm officially retired already, but I like to write still my blogs. I still write to write some books, and I will do some teaching still online and participate in webinars and podcasts, etc. But it's much more as part of a discussion with the next generation to stimulate their further thinking, then it's for my own interest. I don't need much more.
That's really good to hear, because our major project this year is developing a summer school for about 10 to 12 doctoral students from around the world to come together and really basically co-create and try and develop ideas around how we can have a more equitable approach to internationalization. So I think your work will be really inspiring for that. So hopefully we'll stay in touch and maybe we can learn more from each other.
Okay, thank you. It'll be a pleasure, and good luck with all the great work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Hans. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and hopefully inspiring for the people listening to this podcast. Thanks ever so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.